getting started, want to share a little bit about the phase project, especially for some of you who are new to it. I know this is sort of at the tail end of the phase project. We're sharing announcements or kind of updates from research, but going back now 4 years in this project, there's been a lot of work, a lot of commitments, and also turnover amongst some of the IAG, TAG partners. And so do want to say, no matter if you've been involved with this since day one or just getting involved this year, thank you for your participation and for your involvement in this project. We continually heard from Department of Energy, as well as some of you, that the industry engagement in this project is really what made it a success, what made it sort of different and unique, and both on the research side as well as the tools development side, we saw that come through and really be beneficial. So thank you all again for your help and participation there. Also, since we'll be sharing some of the research, I do want to give a special thank you to the host sites and the companies that helped host the host sites, both during development as well as during operations. And so, Alchemy Renewables, Argonne, EDP Power, Geronimo Power, Greenbacker Capital, Innovatus, Lightsource BP, NextEra Energy, Sol Systems, and also University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, all having a role in helping support and sustain this research. So thanks to all of you for allowing this all to happen. So excited to share some of the outcomes of that. And last, thanks to the researchers, the ones that you're going to hear from today, who've been leading these efforts on these different research studies and efforts. It's great that we can share some of these updates now at the end of the project and let you know sort of what's come out of all that research. And so you'll hear from each of them as we go through. But again, you'll hear today from Laura Fox from Argonne National Lab, James McCall from NREL, as well as Jay Martin from NREL. You'll hear from Tristan Barley, and I see Adam Dolzal is here from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. We also have Lee Walston from Argonne National Lab. So great lineup of people and presentations to share. So again, we are recording this, so just keep yourself muted if you're not speaking. We will have some time for Q&A either between presentations. We'll also have some time set aside for questions. Feel free to always chat in questions as well as you have them, and we can address those either in the chat or during discussion as well. So again, purpose of today is to mainly provide updates on some of the research that's been happening through phase. And also, since the phase project is officially closed, talk about sort of future engagement and updates for this group looking into the future. So as I mentioned, we have a jam-packed schedule. I just wanted to put that on here, the agenda, not that you're going to follow that minute by minute, but just so you can see what to expect. And we're going to do our best to keep this moving here quickly. So as we start, I do want to give, again, just a brief intro to phase, especially for some that might be new to it, or if you haven't connected with the phase project in a while, this gives you a chance to have some of that context and kind of think about what's been done here. As we think about why phase was originally needed, this project really originated from the demands that the industry was hearing from multiple angles, right? From communities, they were asking developers to address land use and sort of the aesthetic concern as ecological concerns on developments. Agencies had interest in requesting pollinator habitat and also with compliance with local laws, regulations. And then of course the industry itself was asking how to do this and scale up appropriately in a compatible way with the operations of those facilities, and also to reduce risks in the process. And so, those were really driving the research questions behind phase, which was researching how do we scale and how do we configure pollinator habitat at utility scale solar facilities, which at the time we started this, we were considering 10 megawatts or larger. So with that, reviewing and evaluating the ecological, economic, and performance impacts. So again, some of the research you'll hear from today is really addressing that particular objective and some of the questions that we were asking around that. And then, like you may have seen before, we also wanted to create comprehensive guidance and tools to help support decision-making on projects. And so we previously shared the phase tools and provided those. Those are still available via the website. So, as a reminder, this was a Department of Energy funded project going back to 2021. And so the project did officially end at the end of February this year. And so even though the project is officially closed, some of the research now is just now getting published and out there, which is why we wanted to have this call today to be able to share some of those updates as those are becoming available. And again, that focus was on a combination of research and tools. And so you'll hear about some of both of those today. And again, the thing that really made this special was that participation from all of you and those who couldn't be here with us today. But that participation from industry, from agencies, from other researchers and practitioners, really, I think at the end, they made a difference with this project to make it practical and useful. Again, a lot of that input went into the tools that we've previously shared that you can get on the website. So, as this research was happening in the field, we were coordinating with the research team to develop these tools. Again, leaning on a lot of you for your input into the development of those, so that at the end of the day, they were something as a practical resource for you to be able to use. And again, if you are using those, if you're sharing those, I would love to hear that feedback. We're always interested in hearing how those have been used and how they could be improved in the future. As far as the outreach side of phase, we have received a number of views on the website through those phase project web pages. Over the past 2 years, we've had over 5,200 views from over 1,700 unique users. Having conversations at conferences and meetings and one-on-one meetings, we're hearing about cases of uses of the manual, the calculators, of online tools across the industry and also across stakeholders. I think we've found that some conservation organizations as well as regulating agencies have found those helpful just for their own reference and sharing and communication as well. We're happy to see that the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures highlighted phase tools and some of this work as contributing to nature-positive outcomes for the energy sector. So they have energy generation guidance that highlights and directs people to this work. Similarly, IUCN and IPESA recently published just 2 weeks ago a compendium on co-use for wind and solar power generation, and they also point to the phase work and some of the research as providing, again, towards beneficial outcomes. And as I mentioned, some of the research, you're going to be hearing about this today, but some of this work has been published already. So just a brief summary of some of the papers that are currently out there. So again, you'll hear about some of the details of these here, but it's great to see at the tail end here, this research getting published, getting out there. Hopefully some of you have already read some of these papers, use them for your own reference to inform your own decisions, but happy to have that. All right, so with that, again, wanted to get you reacquainted with the phase project and where it's been. I am now going to turn it over to Laura to share a little bit on the ecological effects. And Laura, I'm going to give you control here.
Okay, thanks. Laura Fox with Argonne National Lab. I'm just going to jump into some of the vegetation research and results that we were able to accomplish during the phase project. So our main hypothesis, which I'm sure all of you have heard and know, is the establishment of the pollinator supportive seed mixes should and will provide multiple conservation co-benefits. So increased abundance and diversity of the pollinators, birds, bats in and near the facilities. Let's see how I move this. One sec. Oh, down. There we go. Okay, too far. So the slide's showing our 3 different vegetation treatment groups that we looked at during phase. So we have solar grass, solar pollinator habitat, and then we also looked at offsite reference areas. Our methodology included, it was based on the Xerces Society's pollinator habitat, which we also used for our vegetation. We had 100-foot transects that we set up in all the vegetation types, and we noted all blooming vegetation that we saw in that 100-foot transect, and then we noted our top 3 most dominant. This is a slide that's from NREL from Jay, and it's just showing the difference in the seed mixes between two different vegetation types. So you have the solar grass on the left, which is primarily grasses, maybe a few clovers, and then on the right, you're looking at a seed mix, which is the solar pollinator habitat, many more forbs, and a more diverse pollinator or more diverse seed list. You can see too in the images in the center. Um, for instance, the pollinator habitat has 8 forbs and 9 grasses, whereas the grass would only have about 3 forbs, generally clover. See, there we go. This is just a quick image of where our transects would be at different solar facilities. Usually the pollinator habitat was along the perimeter, so we'd set up transects along there, and then within the arrays were generally the grass seed mixes. We captured lots of weather notes, shade, wind, all of that data. And I can jump into into some graphs. We have calculated floristic quality index for the solar facilities based on the blooms that were observed. So these are 2 separate phase sites. You can see in 2023 versus 2024, there's an increase in the FQI values, which is good. It's as the vegetation is establishing, you're seeing an increase in FQI. FQI is used as kind of a quality index for restoration sites, prairies, and whatnot. Can jump to another graph, which is also showing FQI. This is showing average across our phase and inspire sites. So it's years 1, 2, 3 on the left of phase sites, since those are these sites are newer. And we wanted to look at how they compare to our inspire sites, which are more established. And for those sites, the FQI is kind of leveling off and it's higher, which is great and what we would want to see. Despite having our increased FUI, this is a graph that's from Tristan, who you'll hear from later. We did still see tons of weeds throughout all of our transects. Just want to throw that in there since it wasn't all perfect seed mix establishment. Some factors influencing the establishment could be the prep, mowing and frequencies. Sometimes mowing too often, you're not letting the forbs go to seed. Herbicide application. I'll show one quick graph about precipitation impacting the vegetation establishment, shade, what we're seeing under the panels versus in the middle of the arrays. And then time. Is 3 years enough for us to get all this data and make some good answers? I just wanted to quickly show this pollinator graph before I pass it along, but our pollinator presence is obviously tied to the blooms that we'll see. And in 2023, we had a little dip there. As we dive into our data, we are starting to see that was maybe a really dry year. And so we're going to look and see if the precipitation is playing a part. Also just shows we did investigate those off-site fields, ag or old field, and we did always see less pollinators in those places. And I think that's my last graph. Yep. I think James.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So basically, it's just following up. So basically, NREL did some similar kind of, if you want to go back, thanks. Uh, if you could like modulate that a couple more times, I think that would be like pretty helpful. But basically, NREL did some kind of like very specific kind of similar kind of vegetation research in that we kind of did these 1 foot or 1 meter by 1 meter transects in kind of different areas among the array, and specifically we were focused on different types of seed mixes that are both exist inside and outside of the array. And so we did kind of small plot vegetation surveys, and I think we basically did a full scale investigation of which species, grass forbs or others, kind of were in there, and then kind of some of this comparisons. And then we included the different seed mix test plots in here, and that's a kind of a comparison and kind of used. And I think Tristan is going to use this kind of broader data to kind of compile all of this in kind of a synthesis paper coming out at some point in the future. But if a site is interested, we can provide kind of which species establish better in kind of different areas, under the panels or outside the panels. That can be useful for the future. We can kind of compile that data. And we can also kind of provide detailed coverage for kind of, basically the weed coverage. Native recruits are those just basically not planted in the mix, and then those that are kind of seeded. And so that's some of the type of data that we can kind of provide. But we prepared two quick graphs if you want to go to the next slide. The first one is going to be kind of the species richness, or basically kind of like in what areas are we seeing more and more species that kind of exist or basically established over time. And I think the rough trend here is basically that from 2023 to 2024, we saw an increase in richness or an increase in the number of species seen at the different sites, with a few kind of exceptions, kind of in there, and that basically shows that there is some establishment of that. And if you want to go to the next slide, this is also then coupled with the FQI, which then, same as kind of like Laura mentioned, it's basically similar information, but in different kind of areas. And it was actually interesting that in like a lot of the areas that we studied, there was a difference between underneath the panels and also in the buffer. And so sometimes, in particularly kind of like looking at different years and different sites, there is kind of a different response, and that makes sense based on a lot of kind of different climatic factors. But I think overall, kind of like what we saw at pretty much most of the sites was a decrease in weed coverage and an increase in kind of basically what was planted, basically showing that like established. But there are some exceptions that I can pass over to Jay, because she was actually able to do the surveys this year. So Jay, is there anything else that you want to highlight on this?
Yeah, thanks, James. I can just add, yeah, that I think overall the weed coverage went down, and then there were more establishment from the actual seeded mixes overall, but there were quite a few exceptions, like at a few sites, especially in the turf grass area, there would be more weed mix in 2024 than in 2023. So greater presence of different weed species, and greater coverage in some areas from possibly just due to weed populations growing over time if they're not managed, or encroaching from the outside.
Awesome. I think if there's no questions, then I can pass it off to the next speaker.
Yeah. Thanks for that, James. And Jay and Laura. I do want to pause there and see before we get to Tristan, see if people do have questions on any of this. It's really interesting stuff. And that was one of the questions I had for you was um, whether or not the FQI kind of actually incorporated some of the weed species that you had. So that's good to know you did. Is that then why the FQI for like let's say like the low mo fescue mix that we see on the graph, that was lower, that you were seeing more weed presence in those situations?
Or in that the Lomo fescue basically had less flower that she planted. It is, I think could kind of be the other response. The FQI is not going to kind of count grasses, but Laura or Jay, please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think the native grasses will get a score, but generally the weeds are a 0. And that does lower your score because they'll be divided by the number of species that you'll find in the area you're looking in.
Yep, we did include the grasses in the FQI for this, and like Laura said, any invasive species get a 0 if they're non-native. So
The main
those
difference
bring the
between
score down.
what we did versus NREL is that we were primarily looking at blooms. So our FQI scores are based on blooms, which is slightly different, since our research was tied more towards the pollinator presence, and NREL included all species present.
Great.
I gave up my control, so you can assign it to whoever's next.
Yeah. No, thanks, Laura. I can do that. Just want to pause, see if there's other questions. Again, you can put them in chat. You can come off mute. Okay, thanks, Janine. I see a question there. Was there a correlation between seeding rate and weed abundance? So, oh, Laura, Jay, or James, if maybe wants to respond to that.
I don't know if we've assessed that on that front. I think something that we could look at. There was one site that
Mhm.
we did modulate the planting rate, but I would need to kind of go back through the data and see um, that. I do know that at the site that we did do the density difference, we did see more of what was seeded kind of established early, and I think that makes sense. But I think the issue will be kind of the persistence over time if that has kind of an impact. So I think that's something we can look into, Janine.
Yeah, same. I think at some point we looked at like kind of a success rate and we're getting a percentage, but it was early on in the project saying we'd seen 20% of the species that had been planted, but we have all of that data and can dive into it.
Great.
This is Heidi. I'm just going to add to it. This is very qualitative, but um, I can recall the site where we did the double density seeding in one transect, and I don't think that it established well. In fact, that transect seemed to have more dense grass over time. So, I mean, James, yeah, you guys probably can, look at it, verify that my impression is right on that. But it's interesting, but we don't have much data.
Great. Laura, more question for you. The comparison with the old field kind of control, were those like sampled same day, like just to account for
Mhm.
like weather and changes? Okay,
Yeah. So when we ran our transects, we would run them the same day, all same time, same weather.
great.
Yeah, we were generally looking at ag fields that were adjacent or old fields adjacent or very close that we had permission to survey.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, well, if no other questions, Tristan, I'll turn over to you. You should have control, so I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, let's see. Oop, hold on. Oh, I kind of have control. Okay, I see. I can
A
click
little
on
bit
the
of a
bottom.
delay.
When you did this, I thought I was going to be the problem. You stressed me out as soon as you said you were going to give me control. I'm very happy I have control. I should be good. Okay. So hello, everyone. My name is Tristan Barley. I am a PhD student in Dr. Adam Dolezal's lab, and I'm going to be presenting on the University of Illinois portion of this research, looking at the insect response. And this is actually part of my dissertation research. And so when thinking about this response of insect communities in these habitat spaces, informing our hypotheses, I was thinking quite broad. So we're really looking at solar versus agriculture. As a lot of you know, solar energy is expanding in these heavily working landscapes, especially in the Midwest. These landscapes are described and characterized by a lot of corn and soybean. And so when we take those kind of very simplified areas, those corn and soybean plots that don't offer a ton of benefit to insects, and we put a solar facility there, what do we see? And we would predict that we would see a response in the insect community. We'd see an increase in diversity and abundance of bees and other pollinators just because the landscape is getting a little bit more complex when compared to corn and soybean. But kind of the power of ecovoltaics, in particular the power of the phase system, because we had so many research facilities that we were working with, that in the facilities were so big, we were able to divide them into multiple sample areas, we can actually look at a more nuanced way at this question. And so we can break down solar by areas that are seeded with more pollinator mix versus that conventional turf grass, and then compare those to agriculture as well, kind of getting more nuanced results. And when we look at it like this, I would predict from my research that we'd see more of a gradation. So we'd see that highest response in abundance and diversity of insects in areas that have been seeded with pollinator-friendly seed mix, and this makes sense. It's more habitat that's tailored to insects, so it would make sense that they would actually respond more greatly in that area versus conventional grass, which still will add some complexity to the landscape and maybe some weedy flowers established, but it probably won't get as much of a benefit, or we won't see as much of a benefit. And then agriculture, we'd still expect to see the lowest. And the reason I want to look at it in this way is because in the Midwest, a lot of the landscape is dedicated to agriculture. So for my portion of the research, the University of Illinois portion, we specifically looked at a sub-portion of our solar facilities that were just in Indiana and Illinois. And in these landscapes, most of the land is dedicated to agriculture, but more specifically, it's mostly dedicated to corn and soybean monocultures. And so if you look at this picture of just an endless cornfield, where do we find habitat in these spaces? And traditionally, we find them in these voluntary conservation programs. So some of you may have heard of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Conservation Reserve Program, CRP. And this conservation program entails the U.S. Department of Agriculture providing leasing or rental payments to local landowners, farmers, for turning agricultural spaces into pollinator habitat or habitat of different designations, some of which are pollinator. I highlight CP42, so pollinator habitat, and then CP43, prairie strips. These are just strips of prairie placed alongside agricultural fields. These are two of the most common CRP practices that can encourage pollinator habitat creation. And there are also some non-government organizations such as Pheasants Forever that can get involved in that. But mostly this is just conservation through voluntary action. And it can add up. This is just looking at Indiana, Illinois, and a couple other Midwestern and Great Lakes states. And across these states, the selection of states, we see 412,000 acres of specifically CP42, so that's CRP pollinator habitat designation. And this isn't insubstantial. That's quite a bit of habitat. So there's quite a bit of potential in creating habitat in these agricultural spaces. But unfortunately, we've been seeing a lot of declines over the years. So specifically for that Conservation Reserve Program, that program peaked at about 36 million acres across the United States in 2006 or 2007, and it's been declining ever since. There's been about a 38% decline since 2020, and we now have about 22 million acres of habitat. And while it's obviously not good to lose conservation habitat for insects, we've also seen simultaneously an increase in the intensity that we are doing our agriculture. So the map on the right there is from a paper looking at agriculture across North and South Dakota. And the areas of red and yellow are areas where we had an increase in corn and soybean farming. Not that we are increasing the total acreage of our farming products or our farming yields, but that we are switching from these more specialty crop systems and diverse cropping systems to only focusing on corn and soybean. And so this is an example in the North and South Dakota, but we see that in areas like Indiana and Illinois as well. We've switched from these specialty crops more towards monocultures of corn and soybean. Dan, I don't know how you just did that.
Sorry,
You're messing with my flow. Hold on.
Sorry. There you go.
Okay. So this is kind of a 1-2 punch as far as insect conservation is concerned. We're losing valuable habitat and we're simplifying the landscape even further. Hold on, can I actually click? I can't. Okay, so sorry, a little hiccup, I think. Okay, it is, my keyboard is working again. So while this is happening, it's probably unrealistic that we're going to turn large swaths of Midwestern agriculture into prairie landscapes. However, we are turning a lot of agricultural land into solar projects, as a lot of you know. Solar is expanding rapidly, particularly in these working landscapes, where we can build facilities that can be up to 2,500 acres in size. That's huge, and there's so much potential there. And from the phase project alone, we had over 6,000 acres of development that we were working with. And so that's a lot of potential habitat that could offset those CRP losses and help add some complexity to the landscape. And so while solar habitat, ecovoltaics is very new, this idea of putting conservation habitat in these agricultural spaces is not. And so I had mentioned that we had some predictions and hypotheses earlier. Well, how did we get to that point? Well, we can look at CRP land, specifically prairie strips. So as I had mentioned, that practice of putting prairie habitat in the margins or in waterways next to agricultural fields. And there's been tons of studies in this system to see what benefit it provides from ecosystem services, but also the insect community response. And we can use this to apply to ecovoltaics and better understand what would we expect to happen when we put solar facilities with pollinator habitat in this matrix of corn and soybean. And so from those studies, we see that we do see a response in the pollinator community. So what you need to take from this graph is that the researchers looked at a wide variety of ecosystem services, and others here will be better poised to talk about surface runoff and native plant cover and water runoff. But the box highlights pollinator response. So pollinator abundance, insect taxa, and the higher those numbers, the more of a response we saw. And the takeaway is that when you put habitat in those agricultural spaces, even though they're right next to these matrices of corn and soybean, we do see a response from the pollinator community. If you build it, they will come. And there's another aspect of this other than creating habitat, and that is it creates a refuge from for these insects away from insecticides. So there's been lots of studies on using less insecticides in crop fields. The pictures here show a study that looked at a cornfield, so a plot of corn, and they put in the middle of that specialty crop. So in this case, watermelon. But we can take watermelon and we could make that pollinator habitat instead, right? This is something, corn does not have pollinator benefit, but watermelon is a pollinator dependent crop. So we could put other crops, we could put pollinator habitat, and the takeaway would be largely the same. And in this study, the researchers looked at conventional habitat or conventional agriculture, so spraying insecticides more proactively, trying to get ahead of infestations. And in those watermelon plots, they had experimentally used more IPM, insect pest management, which is more thoughtful use of insecticide spraying. And when they do that, they found that these refuges of habitat, so these areas where we sprayed more thoughtfully, we saw a response in the pollinator community. So when we sprayed less, we saw more pollinators. And that just makes sense. There's less insecticides in the system. We'd expect to see more insects. And so when we take both of these things together, putting habitat in agricultural systems and combining that with refuge for insects from insecticides, we can kind of start to get some predictions of what we expect to see in ecovoltaics. Now, as I had mentioned, our facilities are so big, some of them are up to 2,500 acres in size. That's massive. That allows us to have multiple sample areas. This is an example map of one of our facilities where we have sample areas all circled that are in different habitat types. So whether they're in conventional grass or they're in pollinator habitat or they're in surrounding ag fields, and they're all independent of one another. And so we can look at all of these different habitat types across a facility and see when you have habitat in this matrix of corn and soybean, do we see a similar increase in pollinators? And do we also see a similar increase when we have less pesticides? And so what do we actually see from our results? So I will preface that these results, we're still working through some identifications. Identifying insects is very difficult, and this is only using bee data. We collected other pollinators, but my lab is a bee lab, and so the bees came more easily to identify for me. The butterflies and wasps are going to take more time. But with that, I also wanted to show our different habitat types across our treatment. So we collected insects using pan traps. So these elevated bowls of soapy water, bees think that they're flowers. They'll fly in and kill themselves in the name of science. And we set these for 24 hours when we'd sample. And then we also had 30 minutes of targeted netting. So we just wander through our sample areas and net any bees that we saw during that time. And so what this graph is showing is we did see a higher abundance of pollinators when there was pollinator mix present. So we have our different habitat types. We have soybean, conventional turf, pollinator mix. That prairie designation, I mentioned this as part of my dissertation research. I have another aspect of my dissertation that involved sampling remnant prairie habitats throughout Indiana, or throughout Illinois, excuse me. It's not a one-to-one, apples to apples comparison, but it shows the high end, the potential that we're trying to hit. What does a really good prairie habitat look like? And this graph is just looking at raw abundance of bees across our soybean, turf, pollinator habitat, and my own prairie sites. And we see there is no statistical difference in the abundance of bees in our soybean or conventional turf habitats, but we do see a higher abundance in pollinator mix. So the idea is that when you build it, they do come. We do see an increase in pollinators, and that is statistically similar to my other project looking at prairie habitat. So it is approaching that upper limit of what we'd want to see for like ideal conservation habitat. But this is only part of the picture. Abundance is not everything. What about diversity? So this graph is looking at all of those different habitat types, but now looking at a Shannon-Weiner diversity index. You can think of this as just a conservation equation that's commonly used to put a number to what diversity we see at a particular site. So the higher the number, the more diverse. Unsurprisingly, soybean, which is our kind of low end, it's not good for pollinator habitat, we don't see a ton of diversity. We see more than double in our prairies, that makes sense. But with conventional turf and pollinator mix, we don't see that much of a difference. Those diversity indices are about the same. And so what that tells us is, although we are attracting a lot of bees in these pollinator spaces with this ecovoltaics, we're not attracting a great diversity of bees. And so while there is great potential here, to get that proper conservation benefit, we may need to think in a more targeted way. What are we trying to attract, and what plants will specifically attract those target taxa? And I just want to mention, not to take too much time, that it does take a lot of people to do this sort of sampling and to identify this many bees. There was a small army of undergraduates who have helped me throughout my lab, so I do want to give them their due diligence. And I don't know if we have time for questions for this section. If you have any, though, please put them in the chat and I'd be happy to answer them. And Dan, you have to take control. Don't make me touch anything related to that.
Sorry to throw you off earlier there too.
No problem.
the screen share, the ability to share control is a little bit touchy, we'll say. But yeah, any questions for Tristan on those results? Do I give people a moment here? Feel free to chat in, or you can come off of mute. While I'm waiting for that, Lee, I'll get you set up for the next session here.
Mess with it, Lee. It's a little delayed. Make sure you're comfortable.
Yeah. Tristan, I do have a question for you. You know, that see, you're having the same diversity between the sort of turf and the pollinator mix. Do you think, was that a function of the age of the sites? Like, thinking of like what Laura was sharing, as like these sites progress and become more established, would that differentiate more, you think?
So it's interesting. I had an undergraduate who, part of their distinction project was kind of looking at the habitat establishment, kind of just playing around with subset of my data. And part of that, they did a ton of background research for us on prairie establishment. So stepping away from ecovoltaics, what do we see when a prairie establishment happens? Like, what does that research look like? And typically what we see is, over time, you actually get the highest increase in diversity early on, just successional. There's, early successional plants come, those might attract pollinators that won't be there when those plants aren't there a few years later. But then it typically goes down and then kind of plateaus. And so given the age of our project, so this is incorporating data up until 2024, that is about when we started to see the plateau in other literature. And so given that we aren't seeing diversity levels equivalent to remnant prairies, I would say it's not going to get higher than that, because now that there's been more establishment, there are certain flowers that were there early that are now going to start to disappear. The establishment is more consistent. We probably wouldn't expect that number to necessarily get higher. And the reason for that is just because if you're looking at bees, for example, they can often be very specialized. So generalist bees, if you think honeybees and bumblebees, they'll visit lots and lots of flowers. And so to some degree, it might not matter what you establish, as long as there's something they can visit. But those rarer bees often are very specialized in that they need a specific flower to be there, or a certain specific flowers for them to actually be present. And so if those flowers aren't there, we're not going to see those diversity differences. So in order to kind of bump those up, I would say you probably need to do a more targeted seeding, like maybe reseed, but specifically add certain flowers that will attract, say, like leafcutter bees, for example. Sorry, that was a really long answer.
No, that's a great insight into that data and the application of it, right? If you do want certain species, or if you're trying to attract diversity, that like actually different floral resources, different flower structures is something that's something to be more intentional about.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it so positive, is that like this really shows that if we put stuff down, we're going to attract more stuff than soybean. And from just a sheer numbers perspective, yes, that's good, right? Attracting something is better than nothing. But if we wanted to more targetedly attract vulnerable species, we might need to put more thought process into what the seed mix looks like, what the final product looks like. Like, for example, for bumblebees, if you want to encourage bumblebee habitat, you need more bunch grasses so that you have those gaps so that they can nest. So that more targeted aspect is my big takeaways from kind of the insect research that we've done.
Great, good to know.
I do see a question or a point from Jay, and this is a very good point. The restored prairies are managed very differently than solar sites. There's that there is a disconnect in how is ecovoltaics managed versus a like restored prairie, in that this is a very new science. But largely in speaking with prairie restoration experts and people who actually do work with solar companies, often they are basing how they are restoring or approaching ecovoltaics based on how you would restore a regular prairie, because that's where all of our research is in. So while it might not be a perfect one-to-one, we are using a lot of those takeaways, a lot of those previous research to inform how we restore ecovoltaics. Because ecovoltaics is so new, we don't have a ton of research on like ecovoltaic establishment, but we do have a lot on prairie establishments.
Yeah. Excellent. Good question. All right. Well, thanks, Tristan. Really appreciate it. Again, if you have other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We will have some additional time for Q&A. If you think of a question after the fact, we can come back and ask that. All right. So with that, Lee, I'm going to go off of mute camera so you have full control. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone. Bear with me a moment while I try to figure out how to control this. Okay, arrow button doesn't work. Oh, yes, it does. All right, great. I think I figured it out. So we're here to talk about birds and bats now. So sort of on the heels of all the good and promising news and data and information that has been shared about plant establishment and pollinator and insect responses in general to these habitat plantings at solar sites. We also hypothesized that those promising trends would also extend to higher trophic levels. So, that we would also see increased abundance or diversity or species richness in birds and bats. Our metrics between the two are a little bit different, which I'll explain here in a minute. But in general, we hypothesize that what works well for the insects will also work well for birds and bats. Without giving too much away, I can say a small spoiler alert that we did see promising responses in both bird and bat communities. Now, if as this photo shows, if we can just get the birds to clean up after themselves, that would be great. So let me talk a little bit about our study design and how we approached this study. In order to sort of get a larger sample size and make a more robust analysis, we did combine data and monitoring information from both phase and Inspire sites. So we conducted passive acoustic monitoring at the 7 phase sites. Those 7 phase sites are basically the 7 sites that are outside the state of Minnesota. So if you look at all the little sun dots in the map, all the phase sites that we monitored were outside the state of Minnesota. There were 5 sites that we monitored within the state of Minnesota. Those were all from Inspire. And so just two different projects, but the methods and the idea was largely the same. We wanted to ask these following questions. Do we see greater avian species richness on ecovoltaic sites compared to these offsite reference agricultural fields? What about grassland species in specifically? So there was a focus to look at grassland bird species primarily because those were the bird species that, for the most part, historically have lost the most habitat over the last couple centuries due to agricultural expansion, you name it, all the prairie systems and grassland systems in the Midwest that have been lost. Those grassland associated species, were more impacted than, say, your generalist bird species, which we can talk about a little bit later. So we wanted to look at them specifically to see if their occupancy and their responses to these ecovoltaic sites, if that also differed compared to reference agricultural fields. And then finally, looking at bats, we were interested to see if bat activity was greater on these ecovoltaic sites compared to offsite agricultural fields. So you can kind of see based on these questions and kind of what Tristan was alluding to in the previous talk, that we are looking at a very specific land use trade-off here in this monitoring design, where we're looking at going from row crop agriculture to ecovoltaic solar energy development. That is the single land use conversion that we're focusing on in this study. And that's because the primary MO of solar development in this region is going from row crop agriculture to solar. So we wanted to sort of explore that very specific land use trade-off in this study. So that's why we chose these specific control sites, row crop agriculture. For the most part, those row crop agricultural sites were corn or soybean fields. This map shows an example of our monitoring design. The nice thing about this monitoring design is we use acoustic recorders that could record both birds and bats within the same acoustic recorder. So we basically set them up to record birds all the way up until about 9 p.m. And then from 9 p.m. to midnight, we recorded bats. So this map kind of shows an example monitoring design where on the solar sites, on these 12 ecovoltaic solar sites, we set up at least one acoustic recorder, and we tried to make sure it was as close as possible to the habitat areas of the sites. In this example, 100% of the solar site is habitat. It was planted and managed for habitat. Some of the other solar sites, there might have only been a smaller section of that site that was planted and managed for habitat. And that's where we focused our acoustic recorders. We tried to get them as close to those habitat areas as possible. You can also see an offsite acoustic recorder location on this map. And again, that acoustic recorder location was as close as possible to a corn or a soybean field. We did not go in the middle of a corn or soybean field, mostly because we didn't want to disturb those agricultural practices. And so as you can see in the image down at the bottom, we got very close to the edge of the corn or soybean field. We monitored for 2 years in 2023 and 2024 in this paired design. So in this paired design, the acoustic recorders were running simultaneously on the solar site and in the offsite control area so that we can get directly comparable measurements. So it's a true paired design. We also took note and measured some other environmental covariates. So as you can see in this map, just south of the solar facility, there's a wooded area and there's a pond. You can also see some urban areas and just a whole bunch of other things going on in the area. We quantified all the other land uses and other land cover types within 500 meters around each acoustic recorder location. And we included those in our analyses so that we could take those into account. Our primary focus was that direct comparison between solar site and offsite agricultural field. But in making those comparisons, we wanted to add all of these other covariates just to make sure that we're accounting for those effects. Okay, so that's a little bit about our monitoring design. And so this was similar for both birds and the bats. Like I said, those usually the same recorder that we used recorded both birds and bats. Because we were collecting a lot of data, we relied on some AI tools to help us identify species and make that life a little bit easier. So we used BirdNet to help us determine the bird species that were present. And then we used two pieces of software to identify the bats based on their ultrasonic recordings, Kaleidoscope Pro and Sonobat. I'll talk a little bit more specifically about each one of those down the road. But first, I'll talk about BirdNet. So because it's a fairly new tool, we spent a little bit of time really trying to make sure that how BirdNet could be used in this study. And we found that for the most part, for most of our focal species, BirdNet worked well. For example, this American goldfinch, we found, BirdNet was able to achieve at least a 90% precision rate at a pretty low confidence threshold. So BirdNet, I don't know if folks know this very much, but BirdNet produces a confidence score associated with its predictions, and you can use that confidence score to determine these thresholds. So in short, BirdNet worked really well for a lot of the species. And using BirdNet, we identified we identified 127 species on the solar sites, and we did confirm those 127 bird species on the solar sites. Most of them belong to, again, what we would call generalist species, but we did identify several grassland associated and grassland obligate bird species. A few of them sort of listed here. Those were the ones that we really wanted to focus on with our analyses, these grassland birds. And what we found was, looking at the grassland species, we found that there was greater species richness among this this focal group throughout most of the study period. So this study period, it ranges from week 20 to week 36. That's roughly mid-May through early to mid-September. And so that was the monitoring period. And you can see that throughout most of the summer and throughout most of the spring, there was greater bird species richness on these ecovoltaic sites compared to the offsite agricultural areas. Towards the end of the season, they start to match up a little bit, and that's what we believe is due to many of these bird species migrating out of the area, and then what you're left with are species that are year-round residents, or they stick around a little bit later in the fall, and those were generally a little bit more ubiquitous across all the sites. We also plugged in the occurrences for grassland species into an occupancy modeling framework. And this allows us to really look at species-specific responses because we were able to look at the effect of location. And then location, again, in this case, is on the solar site or near the habitat areas of the ecovoltaic sites, and then also the reference areas or the agricultural control areas. And so we were able to really look at that effect on grassland bird occupancy, also taking into account these other environmental covariates, amount of forest, amount of water, grassland, you name it. And what we found is, for the most part, most of these bird species do show a tendency towards the ecovoltaic sites. So what this graph is showing is basically everything on the right-hand side of the graph shows a tendency towards the ecovoltaic sites. Everything that's on the left-hand side of the graph, or in the negative space, is showing a tendency towards the agricultural control fields. And you can see that by and large, most of these species do show a tendency. Their occupancy is more strongly associated with the solar sites than the agricultural fields. We do, however, have a couple species that did show stronger associations with the agricultural control fields, like grasshopper sparrow, horned lark. Eastern kingbird showed a pretty weak association. Their error bars, if the error bars basically cross zero, it's a little bit more of a weak association. But the two species that showed a stronger association with the agricultural fields were horned larks and grasshopper sparrows. But by and large, the majority of the grassland species showed stronger associations with the solar sites. I also want to mention that we throughout this project we sort of I don't want to say we systematically identified, but we didn't track all the way through time the number of nests on these sites, but we did identify 236 nests on these sites as we were going through the course of our work. Most of these nests belong to, your generalist species, mourning dove, American robin, etc. But we did identify some grassland bird species nesting on these sites, like red-winged blackbird, eastern bluebird, dickcissel, and some others. So all this information was just recently published in a journal article that was just published yesterday, in fact, in the Journal of Applied Ecology. And in that article, we kind of talk a little bit more in depth on how these solar sites can be novel ecosystems where, by and large, they show a promise to biodiversity at large, but there might still be some species-specific responses that maybe differentiate. They might be a little bit different than others, including the grasshopper sparrows and the horned larks in our study. It kind of indicates that some species might be winners. They might respond positively to these new systems, and then there might be some species that are quote unquote losers. They might respond negatively or avoid these new systems, and so it's kind of opening up a world of information that indicates that while these practices may be good for biodiversity on a whole, there still may be some species that just don't show up. And we're, like Tristan was saying earlier, that might be true for some insect communities or insect species. This also might be true for some bird species as well. So that's a little bit about the birds. Happy to answer any questions. But before that, I just want to quickly dive into the bats. So we use the exact same monitoring design for the bats as we did for the birds, same acoustic recorders, same locations, etc. It's just now we're using a different tool set to analyze the bat calls. So we used two pieces of software, Kaleidoscope Pro and Sonobat, and we were primarily interested in looking at two things. One was total overall bat activity. So regardless of species, if these two pieces of software were suggesting that this was a bat call, regardless of species. We kind of lumped it together in like a broad overall bat activity. And then where the two software were consistent in determining a species, we did a species-specific analysis, but we only did species-specific analyses when the two software agreed. So, for example, big brown bat. If both software said that there was a big brown bat in this particular segment of a call, that's the only time that we used activity for big brown bat. Otherwise, we lumped it into an overall assessment of total bat activity. So with all of that in mind, we did generate over 90,000 bat detections. Again, this is total bat activity. And using that sort of during the same time period that we saw before, sort of mid-May to early to mid-September, we found that bat activity was actually greater on these solar sites in, let's say, the first half of the year. So basically going from May until maybe the end of June, where bat activity is greater on the solar sites than the reference agricultural fields. Looking at the species-specific responses, again, when the two software were consistent, we identified 20,000 acceptable species-specific detections among these three species. So these were the three species that were detected frequently enough to really do a species-specific analysis: the hoary bat, the silver-haired bat, and the big brown bat. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to keep this kind of brief. But what we found was basically for two of those species, they did show some pretty distinct differences where they were attracted to and their activity levels were greater on the solar sites than in the agricultural fields. And those were the big brown bat, as you can kind of see in the first graph there. In the first half of the season, big brown bat had greater activity on the solar sites. Hoary bats, they appeared to have greater activity on the solar sites for the vast majority of the entire monitoring season. Silver-haired bats, they didn't really care too much at all. Their activity levels were pretty much the same on and off the solar sites. What this tells us, if you kind of look at all the graphs combined, total bat activity and these species-specific bat activity levels, is that bats don't avoid these ecovoltaic sites. So nowhere in here are we seeing a greater statistical activity on the reference agricultural fields. Where we are seeing differences, it is greater activity on the solar sites, and it's usually earlier in the season. And what this is telling us is that maybe bats are attracted to these solar sites earlier in the activity season when insect abundance and other resources in the surrounding landscape is low. If you've spent any time in the Midwest in the early season, let's say from April till June, and if you look around a lot of these agricultural fields at that time, they're still pretty barren. There might be some crops growing, but they're still pretty small. Insects haven't really had a chance to really thrive in those areas yet. And so maybe during those times of year when, again, the insect abundance is pretty low in those adjacent agricultural fields, maybe bats are choosing then to go to the ecovoltaic sites, which might have a greater resources for them. So this paper was also just recently published in the journal Global Ecology and Conservation. And with that, I will pause. I don't know if we have time for questions or if I've run out of time, but thank you all for your time. I also want to shout out a big thank you to all the solar industry partners that allowed this research to be conducted, as well as the many offsite landowners that also allowed us to venture out into their fields. It was a tremendous effort by a lot of people. So thank you.
Great. Thank you for that, Lee. Yeah, for the sake of time, I want to make sure, because we want to cover Ben and Jay's results here. So we'll hold questions for now, but yeah, again, feel free to chat them in if you have questions for Lee. I know I got a couple for you, so we'll get to those at the end here. And yeah, thanks for sharing that. So with that, Ben, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Dan, and thanks, Lee. And continuing the gratitude train, I just want to thank the whole research team working on this project. It's been a really interesting project. I remember when we were first doing our scoping research team meetings, we had long conversations about the way that bees communicate by dancing, or the bee waggle Adam taught us about. I'd like to thank all the host sites that allowed us to conduct research. on their sites. And then I'd also like to just give a thanks to Zoe Friedman, Ken Hiltquist, and Sochi Menchaca, who are on this call. They've really helped with some of the data wrangling. We had a tremendous amount of data to work with, and we're coming to a really good data plan so that we can start applying it across all of our sites and start drawing conclusions over the time scale of the sites. So just to give an idea of the data that we've collected to date, the top bar on each of these research site locations is our SCADA data that we were able to capture. The bottom bar is the data logger. The green circle is when data collection started, and the red circle is the last data read that we have currently. So for most sites, we do have a good amount of data. We've got 2 or 3 years of data captured at the sites. But with that said, some research updates. We do still have our data loggers on site at each of the solar facilities. We do want to keep collecting that data where possible, working with the host sites. Our research tripods are passive tripods, so they can collect up to 2 years of data before we go out and swap out SD cards. So they're still out on site and they're still collecting data, and we hope to continue to collect data as we expect more establishment of the pollinator vegetation. So we've just some updates on where we are with the data currently. We've determined capacity factors by each of the inverters within the research sites on an annual basis. We're moving that to a monthly basis so we can look at a finer grained performance of those inverter capacity factors. We've developed a data analysis procedure. So a couple of the sites, we've done full data analysis on the variables that we've been collecting. Now we need to take that procedure and apply it to the remainder of the sites. And then we've got some established next steps that we want to do with our research. So the vegetation research is starting to come out. We want to tie our research to those findings. So tie that back to the floristic quality index that Argonne and U of I and NREL are capturing. One of the great opportunities that we have with one of our sites is we can do a direct locational comparison between bifacial performance compared to monofacial performance. We want to look at the sites that have different seed mix varieties within the sites too. We're collecting data in each of the different seed mix types at the research sites. And then the impact of distance between rows to see how that impacts the moisture retention, the humidity on site underneath the panels. And then again, collecting more years of data. We're going to be sending out email requests to the host sites to see if we can get more SCADA system data so that we can continue the analysis over a longer period of time. Another request that we're going to have of the host sites is the National Renewable Energy Lab is launching a machine learning project, and they are looking to see if we can share just the environmental data that we're collecting. So the tripod data that's measuring air temperature, relative humidity, the back of the module temperature, and the irradiance reaching the underside of the panels. They're also interested in getting the MET station data from the host sites and the plane of array irradiance to inform that machine learning algorithm that they're developing. So that is to come from our team. How we plan to characterize each of the research plots and the corresponding inverters as we do start to put out materials for this project. First, the outcomes we're expecting to share are inverter capacity factor, the calculated impact on efficiency. So as we start to get above 25 degrees C or about 75 degrees Fahrenheit, we start to see efficiency impacts on the panel's ability to produce energy. We also want to include those non-energy benefits, so those benefits that we're seeing across the other research activities that are going on, and then the impact on absolute humidity by seed mix. So which seed mixes are releasing more moisture into the air. To characterize each site, we want to share the general location. We want to share the inverter capacity for the inverter that we're looking at, as well as the inverter load ratio. We found that the inverter clipping can cause some thermal backfeed to the panels, and so that's something we want to look at as well. The tracker type, whether it's fixed tilt or single axis, the panel type, the row spacing and the height of the torque arm bar for our tracking sites, and then what seed mix is on site. So first off, we started off by setting a range of the data that we were looking at, right? So here we've got an annual set of data at one of our facilities where we've done a full set of the monthly data. So the pink data is all of the readings that we got on site. The green data is a band between 30% and 70%. So about 40% of the time, those are the readings that we're getting within that month. And then we've got a trended mean as well that's running through the site. But as expected, we're getting about 950 watts per meter squared during the summer months when we are getting the most direct sunlight on the tracker panels. And it drops down to 500, 600 watts per meter squared in the winter. And so certainly decreasing the amount of energy that we can produce in the winter. Then we tied it to the back of module irradiance that we're seeing. Under panel irradiance that we're getting in the summer months is hovering around 100 watts per meter squared. And then just interestingly, I always like highlighting the January and the February months. We're seeing, up to 400, 500 watts per meter squared can reach the underside of the panels. And that's typically caused by snowdrift, so snow accumulation underneath the panels, increasing the albedo. So while we're not getting as much direct sunlight on the front of the panels, we're getting more sunlight on the underside of the panels. So there may be a performance boost there. Then we want to tie it all back to our inverter AC power. So what power are we actually capturing and sending out to the grid? So again, just establishing sort of those ranges that we see across each month for the ability to produce. And I think this is a 2.25 megawatt AC inverter. So that's the output for the system. And then the goal is to tie that all back to back of module temperature. So again, as we see that, 77, 75 degree Fahrenheit, if you just drew a line across this, that's where we would start to see the efficiencies drop off on the panels. And so we want to see, is moisture being released by the vegetation and by the soil at times where we are above that temperature to see if we can get some sort of efficiency boost when we're not already at inverter capacity being sent out to the grid. So the idea is to then take that monthly analysis, looking at the trending data and apply it to some spot checks on specific days to see how the site is performing. So this day that I'm presenting for Site 1B is a particularly sunny day. You can see that we're getting full sunlight throughout the entire day. Our plane of irradiance that we're getting matches our output power pretty comparatively, expectedly. And we do get about a 1 to 3% power loss. That's just from our inverter efficiency, from our difference of putting DC into the inverter and taking alternating current out of it. One of the interesting variables that we've found that are really impacted on the solar facilities is the wind speed underneath the panels. So there's this effective entrainment, or essentially a wind tunnel effect, that as the tracker activates and the panels start to move towards horizontal, we see wind increasing much more drastic underneath the panels than it is at our met station data. So our purple line here is our met station data, and our red line is the under panel wind speed. And then as we go back to that 60-degree stow, our wind speed really deadens off, and we don't see that wind speed accumulating. Yeah, Lexi, I see you've got your hand up. Oh,
Wait, so I took physics like 400 years ago, but like it sort of looks to me like it's like what makes plane wings, you know. I mean, is it like how's I guess this is I've thought about this before because you know I've sort of thought about like how sheep, well, of course I think about sheep, but like how sheep are protect, sorry, how they're like protect, you know, at a fixed tracker site, you know, especially the lower ones, it's like a shelter for them. But then I've been sort of like watching their behavior. Anyway, where I'm going with this is like the solar won't always protect the livestock or the crops from wind, especially stronger winds. And then I've been thinking, anyway, I have lots of thoughts on this. Very curious where this is going and can we learn more? Okay, thank you.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And the idea is essentially you're taking a volume of air that's moving laminarly in a flow, right? And then you're squeezing it into a smaller area underneath the solar panels. And it actually pulls in other volumes of air above the solar panels. And so you end up getting more volume of air underneath the panels, which is increasing that wind speed compared to just the ambient wind speed that we see. So then the next graph here on the right is just comparing our under panel temperature to our SCADA system temperature, so our Met station temperature, and then the back of module temperature itself. So each of the three variables trend pretty closely to each other. And then as we start to irradiate those panels, as we start to generate power throughout the day, that's a main driver on the back of the module temperature. So when we're producing, it's going to heat up much faster than the ambient air temperature or the under panel air temperature. But one interesting thing here in this day, so again, this is the same day, this is the same graph on the left, is this circled area here. So there's a period in the morning, you know, between 5 to 8 a.m. Where we actually see the under panel temperature is lower than our ambient temperature. Looking at the graph on the right, we've got our back of module temperature again compared to our absolute humidity. And so if we look at, again, that 5 a.m. to 8 a.m. time frame, we see a lot of grains of humidity being released from our soil and our vegetation. So as our photovoltaic facility starts to energize, as we start to approach maximum power, we could be seeing an efficiency gain in the morning that may be enabling the site to produce extra power than they would be otherwise. But we need to do more historical comparisons. We need to next line up year after year of data so that we can start to do further analysis and make some assumptions about the vegetation growth and establishment. And I think I'm out of time.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Interesting stuff. Also got questions for you. So I'm going to turn it over to Jay here so you can share a little bit about the cost study that was done on vegetation management. And so we'll sometime at the end, we can go through other Q&As again. You can put them in the chat if you have them, and presenters can respond to those while we're talking here. I am willing to stay a little bit after 1:30 too, if people have other questions or want to continue after that. But with that, Jay, I'm going to turn it over to you. You should have control.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, I'll keep this short and sweet so we have more time for those questions. I'll just preface it saying that this was a data collection effort under phase, I believe in like the early years of phase, to collect cost data for maintaining and planting pollinator habitat at solar sites. And we also combine that with some cost data that me and James collected through an Inspire capital cost project. And that this data, along with further analysis on the cost of raising the panel height for agrivoltaic or ecovoltaic activities, and designing it that way, that will be published later this year. And then also we are working on incorporating that panel height cost data into Atom, which will be the new agrivoltaic version of SAM, the System Advisor model. So you can include those cost increases for changing the panel height into your modeling for the costs. So with that, I can go, let me see. There we go. From the data that we collected about just seed mixes planted at solar sites, and all this is in dollar per acre. You can see here of the different number of sites that we collected data on for each type of seed mix. And you can see that the mean is actually pretty similar between a native seed mix and a non-native seed mix, which might be a very controversial thing because everyone likes to talk about how expensive native seed mixes can be. And while that may very well be the case, if you get looking into like very specialty species that aren't widely available, or if your vendor has to grow them specifically for you, or they don't have a big stock of them, they could get pricey. But just looking at the mean and that alone of this data, they can be fairly similar. So it's not super cost prohibitive to use native seed in all cases. But as you can see, the max cost per acre is a lot higher for native seed than non-native seed. And then looking a little more big picture into installation, these costs look at all these different activities involved with creating pollinator habitat at a solar site. And the combined cost actually includes some more activities other than just decompaction and planting. And I believe Dan just asked the solar companies to provide their combined installation cost for planting these seed mixes and the land prep involved. And you can see there that it is also a huge range of what you can pay to prepare the land depending on what its previous use was and exactly what your goal outcome is, with it being $288 per acre all the way up to more than $4,000. And then you can see here that decompaction is a relatively low cost on average, but can get up to 250 in the max. While planting can take significantly more money. I honestly thought that the planting would have an even greater range because people always talk about the differences between doing broadcast seeding versus using a native seed drill. But even that max only gets to up to 500, so a little more than double the mean. But a lot of them, these sites were using native seed mixes and using the native seed drills. So that is included in the mean as well, being around $200 per acre. And then there's the native seed and non-native seed information again there. And I believe also Dan can confirm that the data used to make these mean, the medians and everything was also used to create the financial cost calculator, which you can play with online to find out more about how to plan a site and get some cost estimates. I also just wanted to add that Ben mentioned NREL's doing a machine learning microclimate model. And so if you have any more questions about that or want to learn more about how your site can be involved, please just reach out to me. I can answer some questions now, or any email would be fine. But we're really looking forward to doing that project so that we can see how different solar sites react to different vegetation mixes and maintenance across the entire US, because what a solar site does in Arizona can look very, very different than what it does in Georgia or Florida and even the Midwest. So we need data from all those different sites all across the US to try and find those correlations and model them well so it can better inform decision making to see the impact on energy output. So yeah, that's all for me. I'll hand it back over to you, Dan. Oh, I do have a takeaway slide. Sorry, forgot about that. Um, one takeaway from just the pollinator cost data is that the capital costs can differ drastically from project to project, with every site having its own challenges. And then the main capital costs that we identified were the height of raising the panels so that the pollinator habitat, the actual vegetation, doesn't shade the panels, as well as the native seed mix, planting labor, and decompaction. And then one particular more soft cost that was identified in the capital cost interviews for Inspire was the cost associated with hiring consultants or specialists to actually design your native habitat and plan it out exactly what that's going to look like for your site, especially because every site is so different. So it's not easy in most cases to do like a one pollinator habitat plan for every single site. It's the exact same. They can sometimes need to be tailored to the specifications of that site and the soil sampling you have there and wetland studies and all of that information, and synthesizing it and creating a plan from it can take some significant funds to source from experts. Okay, that's actually all of it. Thank you, Dan.
Great.
Oh.
Thanks, Jay. That's really helpful. And yeah, Alexia, I see your hand raised. Just to answer your question, yeah, so we did use the mean values to help populate the cost comparison tool. We did some rounding just for, cleaner math, let's say, but that was there. But yeah, Lexi, your question.
Okay. I realize I probably need to take this offline. Like I have a whole pile of questions. So maybe Jordan and I could just make an appointment or something, but like my video won't turn on. But I'm interested in everything from the class of vendor used. Like were the costs like the EPC, or like was it there's all kinds of mid-install costs that are like just what am I trying to say? They're just like overage kind of stuff. Like there's just layers and layers of costs, and then the vendors eventually get paid, and like that's one. And then I'm like, because like you're just paying directly for these costs, and I love that you've extracted that, but I'm wondering, these numbers seem really pure. That's awesome, but then I'm dealing with all this, like my practical side of budgets. I'm just spending so much money on all this other silliness, and wondering how you extracted your figures. And then I'm also wondering about things like why you didn't include herbicide, which to me is a big thing, especially with all native plantings. And like, it seems like you might have done this a single time and then bam, it all like went in. And so what was the site prep like in addition to decompaction? Okay, I'm sorry. I'll take it offline. Oh, the video started working. Hi. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All good questions. And that was one thing, Jay, as you were presenting, I was wondering, I know we talked about this before, but like if we did this again, like how would that data change? In part because there's just more data out there with more sites, but also, there's a lot of industry learning that's happened, and also maybe hopefully some efficiencies. And so like how does that actually affect some of those numbers, right? Because these were just one ask early on in phase. These probably represent, 2021 dollars in estimates, maybe earlier. And so, early as we're kind of developing these large scale sites. And so that may have changed. And to answer your question, why went over herbicide, nobody responded with that at that point. So, again, might be worth, I know, Jay, we've talked about that, like maybe doing another call for data at some point to try to capture that and update that. Did you want to add to that, Jay?
Yeah, I know that's definitely in the plans for Inspire to do more big picture, like LCOM look at different vegetation maintenance over time for these solar sites. And as we've got so many more ecovoltaic sites going up, we think at least I hope we can get real good data on like mowing costs and herbicide costs to get some real takeaways on different vegetation establishment and how that affects that over time. And as you said, Lexi, of like all the different players involved, of like EPC contracts and all of that, that's something we've just started like diving into, I think, with our developer guide that we're making for the Inspire team, and seeing all the different ways that those entities can interact and how other costs can be hidden in certain contracts and things like that. That is really difficult to pull apart. But yeah, we can definitely connect more another time, Lexi, to get at that.
Great. All right. So in the last few minutes, just kind of want to share next steps. And then again, this is scheduled to go to 1:30 Central. I'm happy to stay on extra if people have other questions. I don't know if the researchers can stay on extra, but I know I think there's some questions. But like any good project, any good research, any resource development effort, there's always more things that you want to address or need to address than what you can now. And these are some of the needs that we've identified or that you've all identified and shared with us, as we're coming into this, post phase. And so we talk about like what does phase two look like? What are some of the topics and concerns that are out there? And so see, these are some of the things we've heard. And a lot of it is building on, I think, some of the themes that we've heard here today. Like how do we adapt vegetation systems, right? Sometimes you don't always get the things that you expect. How do we also address concerns around risks, fire risks, worker safety, those types of things, regulatory risks. And then, as always, right, the communication of the benefits as well as the needs for management is something that was identified. So, looking ahead, thinking of course, there's going to be other research needs, and research that can address some of those needs, but then also, continuing engagement through groups like this. Other data updates like we talked about with costs, and also, guidance, resources, those types of things. And so, like I mentioned, the funding for this project ended in February. Seeing the value that I think we've seen out of the research and the tools, we do want to keep this going, and this collaboration in particular, the industry and technical advisory groups. And so our hope is over the next year to, periodically, continue to share news and updates, to convene every now and then so we can kind of share some updates either on continuing research or some of the outcomes that you've heard from the research that's ongoing, as well as related projects. Of course, we are pursuing funding for some of these phase two research and resources. And so hopefully, if we are able to secure some of that funding, we hope to engage the IAG, TAG, as appropriate on some of those projects too, to continue to give insights and input and review to some of those. So we're hoping to continue that convening and collaboration like we've had over the past few years. Again, echoing the value I think we've all seen from that. And so we want to keep that going. The Energy Resource Center, we are having a webinar coming up in December. We're in the process of finalizing the date for that. So we don't have that yet, but I do want to invite you, if you haven't already, if you register on our website, you'll get a notification from the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group when that comes out. So if you haven't done that, there is a QR code here that'll take you to our site, or if you just Google it, you can go there. So if you already receive emails from the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group, you would receive that update of that webinar when that comes out, and you can register that way. If you don't get those emails already, then you can go on register just so you get that in the future. But do, want to encourage you to keep in touch with us on this. I know we're kind of closing in on the end here. I do want to say thank you again to the host sites, to the researchers, as well as all of you for your input. And with that, happy to take any questions that anybody has here. So thank you again.